So Isidore, could you state your name and give us a sense of what your training, your academic training has been to prepare you for a career in addiction science and policy application?
Thank you, Tom. My name is Isidore Obot. I'm from Nigeria. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Uyo in Nigeria. I'm the director of a center, the Center for Research and Information on Substance Abuse in Africa. I got into the field. There wasn't much planning to get into it. I remember, if I look back, it was a course I took in my doctoral program, a course in social psychology, which dealt with the issues of prevention of smoking, basically. So it was social psychological theories about smoking that probably got me interested in addiction generally. And after the doctorate, I was studying in the US. So after the doctorate, I went back to Nigeria to do a 1 year of national service. And it was during that year that I convinced myself that it was a good idea to get more interested in addiction, to do research, because at that time there were issues around smoking among young people, not only smoking cigarette, but also smoking cannabis. So I applied to School of Public Health to go back to the US to study, and I was accepted into Harvard, and so I got an MPH. And during my year, because it was a 1 year program, much of what I did was reading about, studying. There were 2 courses I remember clearly at Harvard at that time, one on alcohol, the other on drugs. And basically that's where it became my life.
Yeah.
And this was around 1983, 84.
And how did you get connected with the World Health Organization?
Well, the World Health Organization came a little bit earlier. My first contact was in 1993 when I got a call from Robin Room. It's very interesting. I had done a survey in the community where I was working at the time in Nigeria at the University of Jos. And I published a small monograph on drinking mostly. There were some other findings on other drugs, but it was mostly focused on drinking. And that little monograph found itself into a library in the UK. So I think Robin was looking for people at that time, I had never met him, with data sets that had variables on alcohol. And somebody told him, hey, there is this thing I saw in the library. And, cut a long story short, Robin looked for me. It wasn't easy. I was at a CPDD conference, and I got a call from Robin. I just happened to go to my hotel room, which is really interesting. And I got a call, and he said he wanted me to participate in this project. It was a WHO-funded project. So that was the beginning.
So it started with you're doing survey research.
Exactly.
With kids in school. You published a monograph. It was picked up because people were interested in looking at prevalence and epidemiology
Yes.
in Africa, and you began to work with somebody who was a consultant with WHO.
Exactly. And of course, that led to other invitations by the WHO, by other organizations. And of course, as you know, in 2002, I was invited to work for the WHO in Geneva. And I came in to Geneva to spend 1 year because it was a one-year appointment and ended up staying in Geneva for 5 years.
Can you describe some of the projects that you worked on when you were in Geneva?
Yes, several projects I can remember. I think the one that I remember most about, because I spent quite a bit of time, was the Gender and Alcohol Project. This was a study in 7 countries funded by the WHO. There were, I think, 2 other countries funded by other organizations. So I was the person doing the running around, making sure that data was collected in these countries.
And this was an international comparative
Exactly.
epidemiological survey of men and women
That's
to
right.
look at gender similarities and differences and trends.
Yes, that's what it was. One of the conditions, of course, was that in your sample size, in your sample, you had to have women. And it led to a book that we fondly called the Brown Book. And the book is called Alcohol and Gender. I think studies in 7 countries or something like that. But I think it's been an important work, a lot of people, and has led to, as you know, to other projects which are similar to that.
And you also worked on a monograph describing substance use in urban environments, particularly in developing countries. Could you tell us something about that?
Yes. That actually came before the gender and alcohol study. That was what we call the urbanization project. This was an attempt to show what was happening in urban areas, especially among young people. It started with the meeting that we had in Japan, and that was the first time we brought academics together, and again, people with some data, and they wrote chapters for this book.
And what were the main conclusions of that study?
Well, I think basically it supported what we suspected was the case, that there was some increasing prevalence of substance use in different countries in urban areas, and some of the drugs that were being used were not things that people might have thought about. So increasing use of new substances was being reported in that.
And particularly there were almost epidemics, I believe, of substance abuse in some of the poorest sectors of developing countries like Rio, Lima.
Yes, like Lagos, Nigeria, Cape Town, South Africa. These were some of the countries that were part of the study.
And how does this information get translated into policy?
Well, that's the actual question. You would expect that policy would be guided by these kinds of information. What we tried to do in that project was to ask people to produce some policy briefs to make the data from the book, and especially from the papers from their countries, available to policymakers to understand what was happening among young people in urban areas. And I think, if I can remember well, so in some countries that actually happened, that these brief summaries were made available. And of course, the book was widely distributed across the world.
Can you describe now what you're doing in Nigeria with CRISA, and what is happening in the African continent that makes your work so important, particularly with regard to alcohol?
Yeah. Well, a lot is happening. You mentioned CRISA. CRISA is the Center for Research and Information on Substance Abuse. This is a non-profit research organization that we started in 1990, actually, at the University of Jos. And one of the things that we do, or two of the main things that we do, First is to publish a journal. We are the publishers of the African Journal of Drug and Alcohol Studies, of course, the only journal of its type in Africa. The other is that every 2 years, we organize an international conference on drug use and society in Africa, which brings people from all over the world. You've been there. To talk about basically what's going on in Africa. It's been very important. Those two things I mentioned have been very important. Right now, what I do most is in the policy area, and we are trying, because there are a number of issues around alcohol policy. My country and many countries in Africa do not have policy. And when you talk with some policymakers, they want to see evidence. And some of the things that we do, of course, is to try to provide that kind of evidence about increasing drinking, heavy episodic drinking, and the relationship between policies and use of alcohol. And of course, in the drug area, having a policy is not a problem because many of them are signatories to the convention, so they do have laws. But there are also things that we are trying to do to make the laws less strict, less drastic, again, based on the kinds of evidence that's being produced, not only in Africa, but around the world.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Isidore, for contributing to this series of courses that we're doing for addiction science education.
Thank you very much, Tom.